want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Go ninja, go ninja, go! Go ninja, go ninja, go!
Although Saturday Night Live has been forced to air its most recent and housebound episodes without the help of a live audience, the NBC sketch comedy has remained a pop culture milestone over its 45 years and counting on the air, with many of its not ready for primetime players going on to be big-name movie stars. And while the 90s era of SNL made many of its cast members into some of the decade's biggest names in comedy, the original cast members who started out with the show in its 70s heyday weren't quite as lucky, especially in the case of both Dan Aykroyd and Chevy Chase, who all but ended their movie stardom when they co-starred with each other in Dan Aykroyd's one and only directorial effort from 1991, which was aptly titled Nothing But Trouble. In 1987, Dan Aykroyd joined his brother Peter and his Blues Brothers producer Robert K. Weiss in attending a screening of Clive Barker's Hellraiser, with Weiss wanting to avoid seeing a comedy to prevent hurting his recently fractured rib with laughter. But when the three men noticed the audience laughing at the film, Weiss got the bright idea for the three of them to make a horror comedy together. And the Aykroyd brothers came up with a script that was based upon Dan Aykroyd's real-life experience in 1978 of getting pulled over for speeding in a rural town and having to stand trial in front of the local justice of the peace. And after Aykroyd failed to interest his past collaborators John Hughes or John Landis in directing his script, Dan told Warner Brothers that the film would mark his directorial debut, with Aykroyd starring alongside his fellow Second City alums Chevy Chase and John Candy. Yet even with its cast of the three biggest comedy stars of the time, the movie grew more notable for its troubled production than its comedic star power. And when Nothing But Trouble finally saw the light of day after numerous release date delays and a change in title, the movie indeed proved to be nothing but trouble, with horrendous reviews from the critics and horrific box office, with the careers of Chase, Aykroyd, and Candy never quite being the same afterwards. But since I loved watching this movie as a kid while being completely unaware of its toxic reputation, I'll give Nothing But Trouble another watch to find out if it is actually something but the opposite of trouble. Or at the very least, find out if it's a better Spies Like Us reunion for Dan Aykroyd and Chevy Chase than their appearances in the cinematic anal cyst known as Caddyshack 2.
If I pull the arrow out, will you please suck out the poison for me?
Oh god, and Randy Quaid is in that movie too. Here come the Christmas Vacation 2 flashbacks. But first, it's time to shell out $50 to $100 to buy yourself a bottle of Dan Aykroyd's Crystal Head Vodka and start seeing dem aliens after you have an encounter with the awfully good drinking game. Take a shot or drink every time you see an on-screen appearance from Dan Aykroyd's brother, Peter Aykroyd, who in addition to writing this film's story, plays the doorman for a swanky Manhattan penthouse, who greets one of the penthouse's tenants, Chris Thorne, played by Chevy Chase, a financial publisher known for giving great tips on the stock market in his weekly newsletter.
I'd like to thank you for that little tip on the market you gave me. The wife says the stock's gone up 5 points.
Good, Mike. Want some more advice?
Sure.
Sell it.
Yeah, if only Peter Aykroyd could have taken some financial advice before he decided to star in the failed 1981 comedy Gas.
There are over 2.5 million men in this city, and 98% of them are horny.
And you wonder why Peter never became a star like his big brother. It's inside this penthouse that Chris comes across his romantic interest for the film, Diane Lightson, played by Demi Moore, who is emotionally distraught partially because this is the first movie Demi decided to make after her blockbuster success in Ghost, but mostly because she's an investment attorney who just broke up with her client/fiancé named Howard Suntz, and is pissed to discover that Suntz is moving forward with a landfill deal without Diane's services.
It's about my professional credentials, my law firm's time. You know what? You just tell Howard that I'm coming down there.
But since Chris happens to be a mutual acquaintance of Howard Suntz, Diane decides to ask Chris if he can drive her to Atlantic City so she can confront Suntz at a sales conference.
So if you're not going, can I borrow your car? I'm a good
driver?
I'm an excellent driver.
If it's that important to you, maybe I should reconsider.
I really like to drive.
Of course, I'm an excellent driver.
It's my car. I'll do the driving.
Okay, great, you drive.
Of course, I don't have my underwear.
Okay, so I guess this rich woman does not have a car of her own to drive to Atlantic City herself, nor does she have any financial means to hire a driver or any friends who could drive her there. She just asked a complete stranger whom she just met in an elevator and happens to know her ex-fiancee? Now that's good screenwriting. The next morning, a hungover Chris is about to bail out on the Atlantic City trip before he remembers that she is 90s era Demi Moore and he has an excuse to get lucky with her without Bruce Willis kicking his ass. However, it appears that two of Chris's clients have learned about their travel plans, a brother and sister pair of eccentric Brazilian billionaires named Fausto and Ronaldo, as played by the late great character actor Taylor Negron, and Bertilla Damas, aka Camila Santiago on Brooklyn Nine-Nine. And before Chris and Diane head out to Atlantic City, they find themselves joined on their journey by these two obnoxious Brazilianaires.
They're Brazilianaires. We'll never see them again.
Good.
Should have known a Brazilianaire never forgets.
Denise, where are we going?
We're going to Atlantic City, Fausto. Get in the trunk.
Put this tape on. Let's chanka.
And I think we know what music we should play when we're on a wacky road trip with Chevy Chase. What? No, I'm not referring to Holiday Road. I was referring to Chevy Chase's self-titled album from 1980.
I shot the sheriff, then I guess I shot some THC.
Holy shit! Where's the Tylenol?
But then the Brazilians get the bright idea to take the car down a detour so the four of them can have a picnic in the countryside. And with the help of the car's high-tech computers, Chris drives the car off the New Jersey Turnpike and into a rundown mining town named Valkenvania, where Chevy Chase mocks the downtrodden townsfolk with his snarky humor.
Sell pork bellies, buy gold.
Evel Knievel and Mr. Clean.
But when the car fails to stop at a stop sign, our heroes find themselves pursued by a local cop, and Fausto dares Chris to try and outrun the long arm of the law.
This is a provincial cop, man. With this car, you could easily get away from him. Let's see if we could do 90.
Well, of course it makes sense to get into a high-speed pursuit over a simple stop sign violation. We all know you can't resist an offer from a Brazilianaire. Now let's drive this bitch underneath the truck like Clark Griswold is supposed to do.
Eat my road, red liver lips.
However, with the help of the cops' high-speed engines, Chris is forced to pull over the car and face the wrath of Chief Constable Dennis Valkenheiser, as played by John Candy, who informs Chris that the laws of Valkenvania state that any lawbreakers are forced to stand trial before the local justice of the peace.
Now, I'm planning not to mention the speeding to him, so I suggest you come quietly and immediately, unless you want more trouble than you're already gargling.
And as the car is escorted to the courthouse, we get to see many beautifully hideous piles of scrap metal and random junk, which were designed for this film by William Sandell, who worked on RoboCop and Total Recall, while Chevy Chase shoots off some lip jokes in the background.
So that's where they buried Flipper.
Flipper's dead?
You must be into folk art.
Welcome.
Okay, Chevy, just because you know this movie isn't that good does not allow you to provide your own riff tracks over it.
Look at all these toasters.
You know what they say, all toasters toast toast.
So it's here we finally get to meet the Justice of the Peace, as played by our director and screenwriter Dan Aykroyd, named Alvin Valkenheiser, with Aykroyd under heavy makeup to play this 106-year-old judge, whose perception of the law is based off an ancient charter established back in 1796.
After the tenets of the old Shire Charter.
Excuse me, sir, that's pre-Magna Carta, I mean serfdom and fiefdom stuff.
Very good, young lady.
And you can imagine that this old-fashioned lawman does not take too kindly to Chris's snarky and dismissive attitude in the midst of his trial.
Wait a minute, what is this shit?
Sir, no cussing in court.
We don't want to hear the story of your life. We just want to pay the ticket and get the hell out of here.
And decides to imprison our four yuppies overnight before a further trial the next day by dropping them through the floor into a pile of squeaky toys, which surely establishes this film in the same universe as Little Monsters. Here's hoping we find the rotting skeleton of Howie Mandel.
Hey, bud. Got him, need him, got him.
But as Chris and Diane await their trial down in the judge's basement, we cut to a group of law-breaking drug dealers who are also driving through Valkenvania, as led by Daniel Baldwin, which gets pulled over by Officer Dennis.
I had a couple, so what? I'm fine.
I'm afraid you'll have to blow.
Blow you? To get out of a ticket? Forget it, Tom.
I'll blow him.
Maybe later. next century.
Sorry, ma'am, but John Candy only picks special girls for him to take down to Camp Candy, if you know what I mean. And yes, I do mean oral sex.
That's not funny.
And after the judge sentences these drug dealers to death after finding several kilos of crack and coke on them, he pulls a lever and turns on a conveyor belt, which leads Baldwin and his gang onto Mr. Bone Stripper, a roller coaster which the judge uses to execute death sentences by chucking criminals inside of a meat grinder and spitting their bones out of the other end.
I'll give you all your coke and your grinders and spoons and pots and guns and knives and all that back to you when you come out the other end.
Boy, I wonder how Dan Aykroyd could have come up with such an insane idea.
Crack and ice cocaine here, and you got your pills.
Oh yeah, that would explain a lot about this movie, especially the scene where Judge Alvin invites his latest captives to join him for a most unusual supper, wherein we meet John Candy once again in his second role of the film, dressed up in drag to play Eldona, the judge's mute granddaughter.
She's single and the best Class A mechanic in 5 states. Struck dumb at birth by a thunderclap.
My kind of woman.
And so Eldona serves our guests an unappetizing dinner made up of discolored frankfurters, ants on a log, and room temperature Hawaiian punch, complete with a Gomez Adams-style model train that pops up out of the table, carrying condiments to put on top of the hot dogs.
Here's how I like them, and I suggest you have them the same way.
Well, that settles it. Seeing Dan Aykroyd sucking on a gray wiener slathered in condiments has convinced me to finally adopt a vegan diet. By the way, if you think that the judge's nose here looks an awful lot like a big
Johnson. Yes, sir.
Then you will be glad to know that the movie's makeup department is here to confirm your suspicions. You know what? Forget the vegan diet. I no longer have an appetite for any kind of food whatsoever.
I won't have my sister, who is once the queen of the Mardi Gras, sitting at a table with a pickle shooting tray.
Yes, the two Brazilians were perfectly fine with Dan Aykroyd sucking on a sausage like a dick whilst wearing a dick on his nose, but having a pickle thrown in his forehead is where Fausto draws the line. Enough is too much! And not only do Fausto and Ronaldo manage to escape the mansion after crossing across a moat filled with toxic sewage,
It smells like Sao Paulo.
but they even bring John Candy along with them, after Dennis decides he's through being bossed around by the abusive judge, who also happens to be his grandfather.
It looks like you need a nice couple of weeks holiday, you know?
You peeled the correct banana there.
It's almost as if these three characters became self-aware of how inessential they are to the script and just decided to leave the movie out of their own fucking accord. Again, good screenwriting. As for our remaining cast members, Dan Aykroyd manages to give one of the best performances of his career here as the demented judge, with Aykroyd writing this character one hell of a fascinating backstory. The reason that the judge is so harsh towards these rich yuppies is because his grandfather was swindled by a New York financier to turn Valkenvania into a coal mining burg in exchange for a bunch of fraudulent shares that ended up bankrupting the town.
We were forced to become what you drove through today. Burnt out coal field.
Which has led to the judge's lifelong hatred towards those greedy bankers.
Banker?
No, banker, no. Financial publishing.
Okay, banker. And will a banker grope for money? And that's why I never let a banker go.
In fact, Chris and Diane even come across a room that is filled with thousands of driver's licenses and IDs, which the judge has stolen from his captive prisoners over the years.
Busload of Hare Krishnas disappears.
Ex-Nazi rocket scientist vanishes.
Jimmy Hoffa still missing, and here's his ID.
Ah, you hear that, Martin Scorsese? The Irishman was factually inaccurate after all. Al Pacino should have ended up getting killed by a 100-year-old judge with a dick nose.
Good night, Harry!
And Aykroyd commits to this crazy character 110% thanks to his wonderful makeup work, which helps the judge resemble a cross between Tom Hardy as Al Capone and present-day Gary Busey. Yep, like I said, present-day Gary Busey. Plus, Aykroyd dons even more prosthetic makeup to play a second character when Diane finds a passage leading to the mansion's backyard and comes across two more of the judge's grandchildren, a pair of deformed men who resemble full-size babies, by the names of Bobo and Little Devil.
Hi, I'm Bobo. That's Little Devil.
Hi,
We're not allowed in the house.
With Aykroyd in the role of Bobo, and Little Devil being played by the guy who served as the hardware consultant on Ghostbusters. Likely because John Candy refused to embarrass himself further with a third role in this movie.
Don't scatter! That's good. Yeah, that's good. Don't scatter. That's not good. No, that's no good.
I mean, these fucking things look like Phil and Lil got into a matter transporter with that bastard. Their heads look like the top of a chocolate ice cream cone from Dairy Queen. And kudos not just to Dan Aykroyd for managing to direct this movie while wearing that prosthetic baby suit, but also to Demi Moore for continuing to act like a professional even when acting against these hideous monstrosities.
I win my deal. No, I won my deal. My hand's on top. My deal, I win.
That's right. No, it's Bobo's deal because Bobo's hand was on top.
Yeah, my hand was on top. I win my deal.
You know, you may look at these mutant baby men and see a couple of freaks, but when I look at them, I see a great opening act for the insane clown posse. But while both Demi Moore and John Candy try to pull their weight amidst all this madness, Chevy Chase gives an incredibly uneven performance. There are moments when you can see glimpses of the same suave smartass who made you laugh as Clark Griswold and Ty Webb, but you can detect Chevy growing more tired with this script as the film goes on. Although he does pep up a bit when his character tries running away and gets caught by the judge's granddaughter, and the judge informs Chris that he's now the property of Eldona.
No choice but house policy.
What's house policy?
Whatever a man touches her is the one she keeps.
What? What are you talking about? Oh, no, wait a minute.
Ooh, looks like it's Chevy's turn to head down to Camp Candy. Yeah, his name is Uncle Buck, and he's here to Uncle Fuck.
That's not funny.
So just as you think this movie's gotten as insane as it's gonna get, along comes a special guest appearance from Digital Underground, the hip-hop group which had just burned up the music charts at the time with their hit song, The Humpty Dance, and who had just brought a young whippersnapper into their group by the name of Tupac Shakur.
Man, would you look at this place? It's like extremely Draculated.
White man's heaven.
And when the band is brought before the judge to face a speeding charge, they're ordered to provide proof of their musicianship by performing a song in the court, namely the song that the band wrote for this film's soundtrack, Same Song. And not only is Judge Valkenheiser entranced by the funky beats and dope raps of this Humpty Hump character and his merry band of singing roustabouts, but he even joins in on the performance by dropping a fat organ solo. You know what? If this judge was behind the killing of Jimmy Hoffa, then perhaps he might have had a hand in the murder of Tupac. Conspiracy. But anyway, in the case of the People vs. Digital Underground, the judge declares the group free to go so that Humpty Hump can be free to get busy in many more Burger King bathrooms. But not before the band does a favor for the judge by performing at the wedding of his granddaughter Eldona and her reluctant new husband.
You may kiss the bride.
No, not in front of all these people, Your Honor.
Now!
Oh, it's not that bad, Chevy. If they had cast this movie nowadays, then you'd have ended up marrying James Corden in drag instead. But after Chris implores Digital Underground to help him escape from the mansion, the judge furiously sentences Chris to death on board Mr. Bone Stripper. A harsh sentence, sure, but after sitting through his performance in Zoom Academy for Superheroes, I'd say it's very well deserved. Thankfully, the machine breaks down and Chris makes it out of the Bone Stripper alive. But before he can escape, the judge challenges Chris to come back so he can exchange his life for Diane's before he chops his lady love to bits with another one of his mechanical contraptions.
Chris, it's Diane.
Run! Run for your life! You really put the pin in the party hog now, girl.
And right before Eldona brings down the blades on Diane, Chris comes to save the day with an explosive barrel of gasoline.
Run!
Unfortunately, that would not be the biggest bomb that Chevy Chase would set off that decade.
The Chevy Chase Show, coming this fall to Fox.
So Chris and Diane finally make it out of Valkenvania by hopping onto an outbound train, where they immediately head to the police station to relate the story of their outrageous adventure. And I can only imagine this was the look on the faces of the Warner Brothers executives when the Aykroyd brothers pitched them the story of this movie. So with the help of detectives Brian Doyle-Murray and Dewey Cox's dad, Chris and Diane head back to the judge's mansion with an armada of police officers behind them ready to raid the place. Now, why they would want to come back to this place after spending all this time time trying to run away from it? I don't fucking know. And after the judge pretends not to recognize his 2 escaped prisoners, he lets them in on a most unpleasant surprise.
Hi, Judge Alvin.
Hi, Dr. Nick.
Evening, troopers. Can't go too far in this part of the world without running across my friends.
Alvin is something, isn't he? Of course, we can't admit that we appreciate the way he gets things done.
And sadly, that was a better Twilight Zone twist ending than any episode of Jordan Peele's Twilight Zone. But after a series of underground coal fires rumble under the grounds of Valkenvania throughout the entire movie, the fires finally erupt into a full-blown earthquake, and the cops flee for their lives.
What's all that shaking?
I don't know. I didn't do anything.
And as the Valkenheiser mansion collapses into ashes behind them, Chris and Diane finally head back to Manhattan in their torn-apart sports car. And as the newly free lovers relax from their ordeal, Chris happens to turn on the news to see a report on the Valkenvania earthquake, which has freed over 50 million barrels of oil from the ground. And before you can say Beverly Hillbillies, we find out that the newly rich judge has survived the earthquake and now plans to move in with his grandson-in-law in New York City.
Grandson-in-law, he lives in New York City. Oh, come on, what? See you soon, banker.
No, you won't. Well now, out of all the ways you could have possibly ended this movie, that was certainly one of them.
That's all, folks. See you soon, banker.
In addition to having its original title of Valkenvania replaced with the generic as hell title of Nothing But Trouble,
Oh, you're nothing but trouble.
Warner Brothers cut several minutes of over-the-top violence from the film to reach a PG-13 rating. And Aykroyd was so disappointed with this film's failure that when film critic Drew McLean suggested to him writing an oral history of Nothing But Trouble's production, Aykroyd replied angrily with, "I think that would be a very poor use of your time, and I would strongly encourage you to make better choices." But even though I acknowledge this movie has got plenty of flaws in its structure and character development, I still put Nothing But Trouble up there as one of my personal favorite guilty pleasures from my childhood, which has got far more creativity and depth than most of the other mediocre movies that Aykroyd and Chase were forced to do after this movie's failure. So whether you think it's a hidden gem or a complete disaster, you must agree that it's a fascinating and unfiltered snapshot into the weird and wonderful psyche of Dan Aykroyd, which is more than worth your watch, as well as being considerably better than Blues Brothers 2000. Now here's hoping that Dan Aykroyd doesn't come back for the new Ghostbusters movie as a singing zombie Ray Stantz.
And we've got a doggone beat now. We're gonna take care of business too.
And on the nudie watch, we have to give up a major show wing in honor of the gorgeous white dress that Demi Moore wears in this movie. It looks like something that Grace Kelly would have worn in a Hitchcock movie, albeit one where Cary Grant was recast with an obese mutant baby man wearing a diaper. However, this would also be an opportune time to tell you folks about the digital underground music video they made to tie into this movie, which not only has Dan Aykroyd popping up in a series of costumes, but even standing alongside Dr. Dre and Eazy-E. Yes, truly it was the end for NWA after they decided to replace Ice Cube with Dan Aykroyd. Straight out of Canada, crazy motherfucker named Aykroyd. I don't think aliens will visit us after 9/11. On the enjoyableness continuum scale from Bull to Bruce, Nothing But Trouble is surely the funniest movie Warner Brothers has ever made about being held hostage by murderous backwater hillbillies since Deliverance, and gets pulled over for violating a speed limit of 9 out of 10. This episode is dedicated in loving memory of John Candy, Tupac Shakur, and our appetites after watching that fucking hot dog scene. I'm Jesse Shade for JoBlo.com, and before we keep rolling on with our awfully 90s summer, I must ask a favor of the newly launched HBO Max. If you guys can finally give Zack Snyder a chance to finish his version of Justice League, then surely you can find it in your heart to let Dan Aykroyd release the R-rated director's cut of Nothing But Trouble. See you soon, streamers!
All around in my hometown, I'm shooting everyone. That's right. I drop a loot, get in the nude.
Chew on this, you stinking relic. Moscow!